My name is Summer. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where people assume things about you before you ever speak. I've been called reliable, calm, easy to work with, the kind of person who keeps things moving without needing much attention. That's usually where the description stops. People rarely guess that I notice everything, or that I remember patterns longer than most, or that I'm patient in a way that isn't passive, patient in a way that waits for truth to finish revealing itself. If you met me back then, you might have thought I was agreeable to a fault, someone who didn't challenge authority, someone who stayed in her lane. I didn't interrupt meetings, I didn't fight for credit, I didn't correct people when they underestimated my role. From the outside, it probably looked like comfort or complacency. It wasn't. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic cinematic way. There are no shouting matches, no villains exposed under bright lights, no sudden twists of fate. What happened unfolded quietly, so quietly that most people didn't notice it was happening until it was already over. This is a story about power dynamics that don't announce themselves, about how competence can become threatening in rooms that say they value it, about what happens when silence is misread as submission, and when someone finally understands the system they're inside. For a long time, I believed that doing good work was enough, that consistency would protect me, that humility would be rewarded. And for a while, it almost looked like it was. Promotions were hinted at, responsibilities increased. Trust, at least on the surface, seemed to grow. But beneath that surface, something else was forming, something subtle, something that only makes sense in hindsight. There came a moment, not loud, not emotional, when I understood the position I had been placed in, not officially, not on paper, but functionally. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. This story follows that realization, the slow accumulation of small details, the decision not to confront, but to observe, the choice to stop explaining myself. And eventually, the calm actions that changed everything happened, without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. I'm telling this now not to settle scores, but because I know how common this experience is, and how isolating it feels while you're in it, especially if you're someone who doesn't fit the stereotype of ambitious or political, but still finds yourself entangled in power games you never agreed to play. What happened to me didn't make me harder, it made it clearer. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently, honestly. Have you ever sensed that a place valued your effort but not your growth, and couldn't quite explain why? To them, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. Always there, always useful, rarely noticed unless something was missing. When I joined the company, my role was clearly defined on paper: operations support, cross-team coordination, and problem solving when things slipped through cracks. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. And I was good at it. Methodically, quietly good. I learned systems faster than expected. I remembered who needed what, when, and why. I anticipated bottlenecks before they formed. At first, that made me visible in a positive way. People said things like, "Ask Summer, she'll know," or "Summer can probably fix that." My name became associated with solutions, but never with ownership. In meetings, I sat slightly off to the side. Not marginalized, just positioned where you could easily forget I was there. When I spoke, people listened. They nodded. Sometimes they wrote things down, and then, almost seamlessly, someone else would restate my point 5 minutes later, louder, with more confidence in their voice. The room would respond to them instead. I noticed. I always noticed. But I told myself it didn't matter. That credit was secondary to impact, that being useful was its own reward. I had grown up believing that competence spoke for itself. If you stayed consistent, recognition would catch up eventually. So I stayed quiet. My boss, let's call him Daniel, often described me as steady. He liked that word. Used it in performance reviews. Summer is steady. She doesn't get rattled. She keeps things running. It sounded like praise. It felt like praise. But it was also strangely limiting, like being described as background music. Steady people aren't seen as future leaders. They're seen as infrastructure. Over time, my responsibilities expanded without my title changing. I trained new hires. I documented processes no one else wanted to touch. I became the person departments relied on when things quietly went wrong. And every time someone said, "I don't know how we'd manage without you," I felt a flicker of pride, followed by a question I didn't yet know how to ask. Why then did no one imagine me anywhere else? I wasn't excluded. That's important. I was invited to meetings, copied on emails, asked for input. That's what made it harder to articulate the problem. There was no obvious injustice, no single moment you could point to and say, "That's it, that's where things went wrong." Instead, there was a pattern. When leadership discussions happened, they happened around me, not with me. When promotions were discussed, I was asked to help onboard the person who got them. When the strategy shifted, I was informed after decisions were made, then asked to execute. I became very good at execution. People trusted me with details they didn't want to hold themselves, complex timelines, interdependencies, sensitive fixes. I absorbed institutional memory like a sponge. And because I never complained, never demanded recognition, never threatened to leave, the assumption formed quietly: Summer is fine where she is. I was the person they leaned on, but never the person they leaned toward. And still, I didn't see it as a problem. Or rather, I didn't allow myself to. I had internalized the idea that wanting more visibility was somehow ego-driven. That ambition needed to be loud to be legitimate. And since mine wasn't, maybe it wasn't real. So I kept my head down, I did the work. I smiled in meetings. I said no problem when tasks piled up. I became indispensable in ways that didn't translate upward. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit the role they assigned me. Not because they forced me into it, but because I never challenged the shape of it. I was calm, capable, non-threatening, and that, I would later realize, was exactly why they were comfortable keeping me where I was. The first moment that stayed with me was so small it almost felt petty to remember it. It happened in a routine meeting, one of those weekly check-ins where everyone half listens while scrolling through their laptops. I had spent the previous week untangling a process issue that had been quietly costing the team time and money. Nothing dramatic, just inefficiency layered on top of habit. I mapped it out, proposed a fix, and flagged the long-term benefit. When it was my turn to speak, I explained it clearly, briefly. I even made a slide, which I rarely did. Daniel nodded as I spoke, not enthusiastically, just enough to signal he was listening. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said, "Okay, let's circle back to that later." The meeting moved on. 10 minutes later, someone else, another manager, louder, more confident, reframed the same idea. Not intentionally stealing it, I think, just repeating it with different language. Daniel leaned forward this time. "That's interesting," he said. "We should explore that." The room shifted. Questions followed. Discussion opened up. Action items were assigned. And my name disappeared from the idea entirely. I remember sitting there, hands folded, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and embarrassment, not because someone else got credit, but because no one seemed to notice the duplication. It was as if my original contribution had never existed. After the meeting, a colleague leaned over and said, "Good point earlier, by the way," as if that somehow evened things out. I told myself not to overthink it. These things happen. Meetings are messy, credit isn't always linear. I had heard all the rationalizations before, and used them myself. Still, something about it lingered. It wasn't the loss of recognition that bothered me. It was the ease with which it happened. How natural it felt to everyone else. How no one thought to say, as Summer mentioned earlier, that was the cut. Small, clean, easy to dismiss. A week later, Daniel asked me to help implement the idea. "Since you're already familiar with it," he said. That sentence landed differently. Already familiar. As if I hadn't been the one to surface it. As if my role had always been to support, never to initiate. I nodded, of course, said yes, took on the work. And I noticed something else then too, something even quieter. No one expected me to object. Not because I wasn't allowed to, but because it didn't occur to them that I would. That realization unsettled me more than the meeting itself. From that point on, I began to notice similar moments. Tiny ones. Easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Ideas acknowledged but not attributed. Effort is praised but never leveraged for advancement. Feedback that focused on my helpfulness rather than my insight. Once, during a review, Daniel said, "You don't really need the spotlight, do you?" He smiled when he said it, like it was a compliment, like he was admiring my humility. I smiled back, but something inside me tightened. Because the truth was, I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted alignment. I wanted my role to match my contribution. I wanted my growth to be seen as natural, not disruptive. And yet, the more valuable I became, the more narrowly I was defined. That first small cut didn't hurt. In the moment, it didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. But it changed the way I listened in meetings, the way I read emails, the way I interpreted praise. I started to ask myself questions I had never asked before. Who benefits from my staying exactly where I am? And what happens if I don't? At the time, I didn't have answers. Just a quiet awareness that something had shifted. Not in how I was treated, but in how clearly I was seeing it. Everyone else moved on, forgot the moment entirely. I didn't. After that first moment, nothing dramatically changed. That's what made it dangerous. The disrespect didn't arrive as a conflict. It arrived as routine, as repetition, as patterns so subtle they felt like coincidences, until they didn't. I kept doing my work the same way, thorough, quiet, reliable. And the company kept responding the same way too. More responsibility, more dependence, no recalibration of my role. If anything, the gap between what I did and how I was perceived widened. Not suddenly, but steadily. Meetings became predictable. I would raise a concern early, framed carefully, without urgency. It would be acknowledged, deferred, and then rediscovered later by someone else, usually after the consequences had already started to show. When that happened, the tone shifted. Now it was important. Now it was visible. I learned the rhythm of it. If I pushed back, even gently, the room grew uncomfortable. Not hostile, just awkward. Like I had violated an unspoken agreement. The agreement being that I was there to support momentum, not challenge direction. So I adjusted. I softened my language even more. I framed insights as questions. I prefaced ideas with disclaimers. This might be nothing, but... Or, I could be wrong here. I told myself I was being collaborative, flexible, easy to work with. In reality, I was shrinking my own authority to make others comfortable, and they rewarded that. Daniel often praised my attitude. "You're so easy," he said once, laughing. "You never make things difficult." At the time, I took that as validation. I prided myself on emotional intelligence, on being steady when others were reactive. But slowly, I began to understand what easy really meant in that context. Easy to overlook, easy to overuse, easy to keep in place. What struck me most was how invisible the pattern was to everyone else. Colleagues I respected, smart, well-meaning people, participated in it without realizing. They weren't malicious. They were just responding to the roles we had all silently agreed to play. And I had played mine well. Whenever I felt a flash of frustration, I explained it away. I told myself stories that made staying quiet feel noble. I said things like, "It's not personal," or "This is just how organizations work," or "I don't need external validation to know my value." All of that was true, and also incomplete. Because knowing your value privately doesn't protect you in systems that assign worth based on visibility and perceived authority. And I was actively minimizing both. I remember one afternoon, sitting at my desk after yet another meeting where my input had been gently bypassed. I felt tired in a way that wasn't about workload. It was a fatigue that came from constant self-editing, from monitoring how much of myself was acceptable to show. That's when I noticed something unsettling. I had started to expect it. The dismissals no longer surprised me. They felt normal, predictable. I would think, of course, they didn't ask me, or, of course, that idea resurfaced without my name. That normalization scared me. Because once you normalize disrespect, you start organizing your behavior around it. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop asking what's fair and start asking what's manageable. And I was managing. I managed expectations. I managed perceptions. I managed my own disappointment. On paper, I was thriving. Strong performance reviews, job security, praise for my reliability. But emotionally, something had flattened. I wasn't disengaged. I was contained. The strangest part was how little anyone questioned it, including me. It wasn't until much later that I understood how deeply I had internalized the idea that being agreeable was the price of belonging, that pushing for growth would somehow disrupt the balance, that my silence was a form of loyalty. In truth, it was convenient for everyone else. Still, at that stage, I wasn't ready to confront anything. Not externally, not internally. I was too invested in the identity I had built as the calm one, the one who didn't rock the boat. so I stayed. And the system learned something important about me, that I would adapt. Every system eventually tells you who it thinks you are, not through words, but through repetition. By the time I recognized the role I had been assigned, I had already been playing it for years. It wasn't written into my job description, but it was understood in the way people interacted with me, the way decisions were routed around me, and the way my presence was used to stabilize situations rather than shape them. I was the one who made things work. When a project stalled, I was brought in to clean it up. When a team struggled with coordination, I was asked to support alignment. When a manager overpromised and underdelivered, I absorbed the fallout quietly. My name was associated with recovery, not direction. And that distinction mattered. Direction belongs to people who are allowed to fail publicly. Recovery belongs to people who aren't. The more I proved I could handle complexity without complaint, the more complex problems landed on my desk. I became the connective tissue between departments, unofficial, undocumented, but essential. If I went on vacation, things slowed. If I were out sick, meetings were postponed. People joked about it. "We can't do this without Summer," they'd say, half laughing. I laughed too. But no one ever followed that sentence with, "So let's make sure she's positioned accordingly." Instead, the expectation solidified. I was reliable, I was neutral, I was safe. I wasn't seen as someone who needed advancement to stay motivated, because I never signaled dissatisfaction. And that was the role, the capable constant. I began to notice how others were allowed to be messy in ways I wasn't. Colleagues could miss deadlines and still be seen as visionary. They could push back aggressively and be labeled passionate. They could delegate poorly and still move upward. If I made a mistake, rare but human, it landed differently. Not as a failure, but as a disruption. As if the system had briefly glitched. Because I wasn't supposed to glitch. Daniel once said to me, during a particularly chaotic quarter, "I don't know how you stay so composed. I'd lose my mind." It was meant as admiration. But what it revealed was more telling. My composure had become part of the company's risk management strategy. I wasn't there to grow, I was there to stabilize. And slowly, subtly, my range narrowed. I was looped into execution earlier and earlier, but brought into strategic conversations later and later. Decisions were presented to me as fates accomplis, followed by, "We'll need your help making this work." It took me a long time to realize that this wasn't accidental. My success threatened something, not overtly, not yet, but structurally. If I moved up, the gaps I filled would reappear. Someone else would have to absorb the complexity I carried. And the people above me would lose a buffer that made their jobs easier. So the system did what systems do. It optimized around keeping me exactly where I was, not because anyone sat down and decided it, but because it benefited too many people for it to change on its own. I wasn't angry when I understood this. I was oddly calm. There was a clarity to it that felt almost relieving. It explained things I had struggled to name for years. I hadn't been overlooked. I had been placed. And placement, I realized, can be just as limiting as exclusion, sometimes more so, because it comes wrapped in praise. Still, I didn't act on this realization right away. Seeing the role doesn't mean you're ready to leave it, especially when it has rewarded you with stability, approval, and a sense of quiet importance. But something had shifted internally. I stopped asking, "What do they need from me?" and started asking, "What does this role cost me?" That question didn't demand immediate action. It simply sat there, patient, waiting. The shift didn't happen during a crisis. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. No one said anything cruel. No line was crossed in a way that demanded immediate response. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in a small conference room, the kind with glass walls and neutral art meant to signal calm. We were reviewing a project I had essentially rebuilt from the ground up after it had quietly failed under someone else's leadership. I had reorganized the timeline, renegotiated expectations across teams, and corrected assumptions that should never have made it past planning. The project was back on track. Daniel was presenting the update to senior leadership. I was in the room, but not at the table, laptop open, notes ready, available. As he spoke, I listened carefully, not out of insecurity, but out of habit. I tracked which details he included, which ones he skipped, and which ones he reframed as collective effort. When questions came up, he answered confidently. When something technical surfaced, he glanced at me, briefly, before responding on my behalf. It was seamless. And for the first time, I didn't feel flattered by that. I felt erased. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just factually. I realized, in that moment, that I had become an extension of his authority, rather than an owner of my own. My competence was being used to reinforce someone else's position, without expanding mine. And something inside me went very still. There was no anger. No urge to interrupt, no desire to correct the record. I watched the interaction with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were finally seeing the system from the outside instead of living inside it. This is how it works, I thought. This is the arrangement. My success threatened their position, not because I wanted it to, but because it revealed how much of the operation rested on me. And rather than acknowledge that openly, the system had absorbed my work and redistributed the credit upward. I wasn't being punished. I was being managed. That realization landed with quiet force. I stopped taking notes. I closed my laptop. Not visibly, just enough that I wasn't preparing to be useful. I leaned back in my chair and let the meeting unfold without my internal commentary. And in that silence, I noticed something else. No one needed me to speak, not because I had nothing to add, but because my silence didn't disrupt anything. The machine ran smoothly without my voice. My presence was functional, not influential. That was the moment something shifted. I stopped interpreting my role emotionally. I stopped asking whether things were fair or unfair. I started seeing the structure as it was, efficient, self-preserving, and indifferent to my personal growth. And once you see that, you can't unknow it. After the meeting, Daniel thanked me, said, "Couldn't have done it without you." It was sincere. I believed him. But for the first time, I also understood what he didn't say. He didn't say my name in the room that mattered. I walked back to my desk feeling calm, not resigned, not defeated, clear. That night, I didn't vent to friends. I didn't replay the meeting obsessively. I didn't draft imaginary confrontations in my head. Instead, I asked myself one simple question. If nothing changes, where does this end? The answer came easily. It ends with me doing increasingly critical work, holding increasingly fragile systems together, while remaining structurally invisible. It ends with my career plateauing under the guise of reliability. It ends with me being essential, but never elevated. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that staying silent wasn't neutral. It was a choice. That realization didn't make me act immediately. It didn't push me toward confrontation. It did something quieter. It shifted my loyalty, from the role I was playing to the person I was becoming. After that day, my silence changed. On the surface, nothing looked different. I still attended meetings, I still met deadlines, I still responded thoughtfully when asked. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer quiet because I believed my time would come. I was quiet because I was observing. And observation, I learned, is a form of agency. I stopped volunteering insights prematurely, not out of spite, out of strategy. I let conversations unfold without guiding them toward better outcomes. When decisions were made without my input, I noted who made them and how. When problems emerged later, I watched carefully to see who felt responsible and who didn't. What surprised me most was how quickly my reduced visibility was interpreted. No one asked if I was disengaged. No one checked in to see if I felt sidelined. My silence was read as comfort, as stability, as proof that everything was fine. Daniel, in particular, seemed relieved. He stopped looping me in early. He delegated execution more cleanly, without asking for my opinion on direction. In his mind, I think, the system was working as intended. That told me everything I needed to know. I began to see how much of my influence had been informal, and how easily it could be erased if I didn't assert it. The authority I had was borrowed, not granted, and borrowed authority disappears the moment it's inconvenient. So I made a decision. If my silence was going to be used against me, I would start using it deliberately. I documented everything, not obsessively precisely. Processes I managed, dependencies that flowed through me, decisions I had advised against, and the consequences that followed. I kept it factual, neutral, unemotional. At the same time, I stopped cushioning outcomes. If a plan was flawed and I had already flagged the risk, I let it play out. I didn't rush in to fix it quietly. I waited until I was asked, and then I responded with exactly what was required. No more, no less. This wasn't manipulation, it was boundaries. And it was uncomfortable. I had built my identity around being helpful, around anticipating needs, around smoothing edges before anyone noticed they were sharp, letting things feel the impact of their own design went against every instinct I had. But I also noticed something else. People started to feel the weight of decisions they had never had to fully own before. Meetings grew tense, timelines slipped, questions surfaced that didn't have easy answers. And slowly, the absence of my early intervention began to register. Not as my withdrawal, but as systemic strain. Still, no one connected it to me directly. Because silence, when it's expected, becomes invisible. Daniel remained cordial, professional. He didn't sense a challenge because there wasn't one. I wasn't pushing back. I wasn't demanding recognition. I wasn't asking for anything. I was simply no longer compensating for gaps that benefited others. In the past, I had believed that silence kept me safe, that it protected relationships, that it preserved goodwill. Now I understand that silence also creates space, and space reveals truth. It reveals who is comfortable without you. It reveals who notices your absence. And it reveals who has been standing on your work without ever acknowledging it. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was allowing the structure to show itself without my constant reinforcement. That's when I realized something quietly powerful. They didn't need me to fail. They needed me to stay exactly the same. And the moment I stopped doing that, even without confrontation, the balance began to shift. Not visibly, not yet, but irreversibly. What they never noticed wasn't my silence. It was what I was doing inside it. Because while my outward presence became smaller, my internal focus sharpened. I wasn't disengaging. I was preparing, quietly, methodically, without urgency and without drama. I started by mapping reality, not the org chart, the real one. I traced how decisions actually moved, not how they were supposed to. Who approved budgets informally? Who delayed things by forgetting? Who depended on which data, which systems, which undocumented knowledge? I paid attention to who asked me questions privately, but never referenced me publicly. Who needed my reassurance before committing to plans they took credit for later? Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped blurring them with goodwill. Entire workflows ran through me without anyone explicitly acknowledging that fact. Reports no one else fully understood. Vendor relationships were only maintained. Historical context that explained why certain things couldn't be rushed or simplified. A context that lived only in my head and my notebook. I had been the memory of the organization, and memory, I realized, is power, if you choose to treat it that way. I also began learning things that were never offered to me before, because no one thought to hide them. I read contracts carefully instead of skimming. I noticed clauses that quietly placed responsibility on my role rather than on leadership. I tracked how success metrics were framed to benefit certain positions while obscuring others. I didn't confront any of it. I didn't ask questions that would alert anyone to my awareness. I just learned. At the same time, I invested in myself in ways no one could see. I refined skills adjacent to my role but not confined by it. Strategy, compliance, cross-functional risk analysis. I took notes not just on what failed, but on why it failed, and who was insulated from the consequences. I stopped thinking like a team player. I started thinking like a system analyst, and the clearer the system became, the calmer I felt. Not vindicated, not angry, calm. Because confusion is exhausting, but clarity is grounding, even when it's uncomfortable. One afternoon, I realized something that stopped me cold. If I disappeared tomorrow, not emotionally but functionally, there would be a delay before anyone understood what was missing. At first, things would seem fine. Meetings would continue, plans would move forward, and then slowly friction would appear. Not because I was special, but because I had been compensating for structural weaknesses that no one else had learned to manage. That wasn't arrogance, it was an observation. And for the first time, I understood leverage not as force, but as timing. I didn't need to threaten anything. I didn't need to announce my value. I didn't need to expose anyone. The system itself would do the revealing if I stopped protecting it from itself. They never noticed my documentation growing more formal. My emails are more precise, my boundaries are clearer. They didn't notice that I stopped fixing problems before they were visible. They didn't notice that I was building a record. Not to accuse, but to understand. Because they still saw me as the same person. Steady, calm, non-threatening. That misperception was the greatest advantage I had ever been given. I didn't rush. Rushing would have been emotional. I waited until my understanding felt complete, until I could see not just my role, but the ripple effects of changing it. And that's when I understood something even more unsettling. My boss didn't need me to fail. He needed me to stay invisible. Because my success, fully acknowledged, structurally recognized, would expose how much of his position depended on work he neither originated nor fully understood. That wasn't personal, it was positional. And once I saw that, the story stopped being about disrespect. It became about alignment. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I was focused. Because when you understand the system better than the people who benefit from it, you don't need permission to change your place in it. You just need to choose the right moment. The private reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By the time I found it, I already suspected something was there. Not misconduct, not malice. Something quieter and more common, misalignment disguised as normal operations. I was reviewing a set of documents late one evening, contracts, scope definitions, internal responsibility matrices that hadn't been updated in years. This wasn't part of a dramatic investigation. It was part of my job. Or rather, part of the job I had quietly made mine. As I cross-referenced versions, I noticed discrepancies, small ones at first. A responsibility shifted from one role to another without explanation. A clause added in a later revision that transferred accountability downward while preserving authority upward. Individually, they were defensible. Together, they told a story. I saw how my role had been expanded informally, while the official structure remained static. How risk had been rerouted through me without corresponding recognition or protection. How success was framed as collective, but failure was traceable, quietly, to the operational layer I sat in. And I saw something else. If anything went wrong in a visible way, I would be the logical point of failure. Not because I was careless, but because I had been positioned as the absorber, the buffer, the person who handled things. That was the reveal. Not that I was undervalued, that I was exposed. I sat back in my chair and let that settle. There was no spike of panic, no rush of adrenaline, just a deep, steady understanding that the arrangement I was in was unsustainable, and that staying silent without awareness would eventually cost me more than leaving ever could. I didn't tell anyone what I had found, not because it was secret, but because it was mine to interpret. I needed to be sure I wasn't reacting emotionally. I revisited the documents days later, then weeks later with fresh eyes. The conclusion held. My success threatened their position not because I was ambitious, but because it revealed dependency. And dependency, when unacknowledged, becomes a liability leaders instinctively protect themselves from. That's when I understood why certain conversations never moved forward. Why was my role praised but never formalized upward? Why growth was always something we can talk about later. Later never came because later would require restructuring. And restructuring would require honesty. I felt something then, not triumph, not resentment, but clarity. The kind that simplifies decisions instead of complicating them. I didn't want revenge. I wanted safety, professional safety, structural alignment, a role that reflected reality instead of obscuring it. And I knew I wasn't going to get that by asking. Because asking would force them to choose between fairness and comfort. And systems almost always choose comfort. So I stopped thinking in terms of confrontation. I started thinking in terms of exit. Not impulsive, not dramatic, but deliberate. Not leaving the company necessarily, leaving the arrangement. The private reveal wasn't leveraged in the traditional sense. It wasn't something I could wield aggressively. It was something I could respond to strategically. I began preparing for a future in which my work spoke clearly, even if I didn't. I formalized processes that had lived only in my head. I clarified boundaries that had been blurred for convenience. I ensured that dependencies were documented, not as threats, but as facts. If my role were essential, it would be visible. If it wasn't, I would find that out too. Either way, the ambiguity would end. That night, as I closed my notebook, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not because I had won anything, but because I was no longer confused about where I stood. Clarity doesn't always tell you what to do next, but it tells you what you can no longer accept. Once you see the full shape of a situation, pretending you don't becomes exhausting. That was where I found myself. Every day after the private reveal felt heavier. Not because anything had worsened externally, but because I was now carrying awareness. I could still perform my role. I could still smile in meetings, but I could no longer tell myself comforting half-truths about where this was heading. I had reached a decision point, not the kind that demands immediate action, but the kind that quietly divides your future into two paths. On one path I stayed. I remained the stabilizer, the quiet fixer, the person the leadership relied on without formally empowering. I would continue to absorb risk and distribute credit upward. Over time, the company would change. People would come and go, and my institutional knowledge would deepen, but my position would remain static. It was the safe path, predictable, familiar, emotionally manageable in the short term, and costly in the long term. On the other hand, I changed the rules of my involvement, not by demanding recognition, not by issuing ultimatums, but by aligning my role with reality, either within this organization or outside it. That path carried uncertainty. It required patience. It meant letting go of the identity I had built as the dependable constant. It meant allowing others to feel the discomfort I had been quietly preventing for years. I sat with both options longer than I needed to, not because I was afraid of change, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting from wounded pride. I interrogated my own motives carefully. Was this about ego? About being seen? About resentment? The answer surprised me. It was about integrity. I could no longer justify participating in a system that relied on my silence to function, while denying me the protection and recognition that came with responsibility. Staying would mean consenting to that imbalance. Leaving, or redefining my role, would mean honoring what I now knew to be true. I didn't tell anyone I was at this crossroads. From the outside, I was still the same Summer, still composed, still reliable, still saying yes when needed. But internally, I had stopped asking how to make things work. I was asking whether they should. The irreversible choice wasn't a single action. It was a shift in posture. I decided I would stop cushioning the system entirely. No more invisible fixes. No more preemptive smoothing. No more absorbing risk without clarity. From that moment on, I would operate only within clearly defined boundaries and allow the consequences of ambiguity to surface naturally. This wasn't punishment. It was truth-telling. I also began quietly preparing alternatives, not dramatically updating my resume or signaling dissatisfaction, but building optionality, strengthening relationships outside my immediate chain of command, exploring roles that aligned with the scope of work I was already doing. Not as a threat, as a reminder to myself that I had choices. The strangest part was how calm I felt once the decision was made. Not relieved, not excited, grounded, because indecision had been the real weight, the constant recalibration, the emotional labor of explaining away misalignment. Once I chose my direction, even without acting on it yet, that weight lifted. I knew what I was no longer willing to do. I knew what I would require if I stayed. And I knew that if those requirements couldn't be met, I would leave. Not in anger, not loudly, but cleanly. That was the point of no return. Not because something dramatic happened, but because I stopped negotiating with myself. Once the decision was made, the need to explain myself disappeared. That was the quietest part of all. From the outside, my behavior looked unchanged. I still arrived on time. I still contributed when asked. I still met every expectation that was clearly defined. But underneath that surface, I had begun moving differently, deliberately, precisely, and without signaling intent. I stopped being the glue. Not abruptly, not defensively. I simply stopped filling gaps that were never formally assigned to me. If a process lacked an owner, I didn't step in automatically. If a decision required clarification, I waited for it to be clarified instead of interpreting it myself. If leadership wanted outcomes, they now had to define inputs. The effect was subtle but immediate. Meetings ended with unresolved questions. Action items lingered. People followed up more often, not with me, but with each other. There was a slight increase in friction, just enough to be noticeable, not enough to trigger an alarm. And still no one noticed me. That was the point. I also began formalizing my work in ways I never had before. Deliverables were documented. Timelines were confirmed in writing. Dependencies were spelled out explicitly. Not to protect myself from blame, but to ensure clarity existed where ambiguity had once been quietly absorbed by me. This changed how people interacted with my role. Suddenly, my involvement required intention. At the same time, I took careful steps outside the immediate frame of my position. I connected with legal and compliance, not to raise concerns, but to understand the structure. I reviewed reporting lines, escalation paths, and risk ownership. I asked neutral questions framed around best practices and future-proofing. No one felt threatened, because nothing I was doing looked reactive. It looked responsible. I also began redirecting credit, not aggressively but accurately. When asked about outcomes, I described processes, not heroics. I named contributors in writing. I referenced documentation instead of improvising solutions. It was remarkable how this shifted perception. Without my constant presence smoothing things over, leadership had to confront complexity directly, not as a crisis, but as a reality. The systems they believed were stable began to show strain, not because they were failing, but because they were no longer being quietly compensated for. Daniel remained cordial, polite, professional. He didn't change his behavior toward me, which told me he still didn't see what was happening. And that was intentional. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about not giving people a target. I wasn't challenging authority. I wasn't escalating concerns. I wasn't signaling dissatisfaction. I was simply aligning my behavior with my role and allowing the system to respond accordingly. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing for any outcome. I updated my internal records. I ensured my work was portable, not in the sense of files, but in clarity. I made sure nothing essential depended on undocumented memory. If I stayed, this would protect me. If I left, it would protect the organization. Either way, it was the ethical choice. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly absence creates awareness, not of a person, but of function. People don't miss you when you stop talking. They miss you when things stop working the way they used to. And still, no one connected the dots. Because quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It lets reality speak. The consequences didn't arrive in the form of a collapse. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small ways. Missed handoffs, duplicated efforts, decisions that took longer than usual because no one was quite sure who owned what. People started sending follow-up emails that began with, "just checking," or "wanted to clarify." The system had lost its quiet translator. And without that translation, friction increased. I noticed it in meetings. Conversations looped without resolution. Someone would say, "I thought you were handling that," and someone else would reply, "No, I assumed it was already done." These weren't new problems. They had always existed. They were just no longer being absorbed by me. Still, no one said my name. That was the strangest part. The discomfort remained abstract, distributed, hard to pin on any one person. Leadership felt it as a drag, as inefficiency, as a sense that things were somehow harder than they used to be. Daniel began asking more questions. Not of me, of everyone. He seemed unsettled, though he couldn't quite articulate why. The confidence he had once carried into meetings softened into carefulness. I answered questions when asked, precisely, without overreach. I didn't volunteer solutions unless they fell squarely within my defined responsibilities. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. What changed most noticeably was how others reacted to problems. Without a default fixer, accountability became visible. People had to own their decisions, and some of them weren't used to that. Deadlines slipped, not catastrophically, but enough to be noticed. Clients asked for updates more frequently. Internal stakeholders expressed frustration. The tone shifted from casual to cautious, and slowly, leadership began looking for patterns. They reviewed workflows, they asked for status reports, they held longer meetings. They implemented temporary fixes that addressed symptoms, not causes. None of it worked, because the issue wasn't effort, it was structured. And the structure had been held together by invisible labor for a long time. I felt a surprising sense of neutrality during this phase. Not satisfied, not guilt, just observation. I had worried, briefly, that I would feel responsible for the discomfort that followed. I didn't, because I hadn't caused it. I had simply stopped preventing it. Daniel eventually scheduled a one-on-one. "How are you feeling?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. The question felt generic, procedural. "I'm good," I said, and I was. He nodded, then hesitated. "It feels like things have been harder lately." I waited. He continued. "I can't quite put my finger on it." I still didn't fill the silence. This was the moment I realized where the old version of me would have stepped in, would have named the problem, would have reassured him, would have offered to fix it. Instead, I let the system speak for itself. Eventually, he shifted the conversation. Asked about timelines, deliverables, my workload. Everything was on track. That unsettled him more than if it hadn't been. Because if I was fine and the work was being done, then the issue wasn't performance. It was dependency. And dependency, once felt, is difficult to ignore. From that point on, the tone around me changed. Not in warmth, but in attention. I was included earlier in conversations, asked for input more explicitly. My perspective was suddenly valuable. But the structure remained unchanged. They wanted relief without recalibration, and I was no longer willing to provide that. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already asking the wrong question. They weren't asking why the system had become fragile. They were asking how to make it feel stable again. That distinction mattered. Leadership meetings grew more frequent, not more effective, just more frequent. New frameworks were introduced, temporary task forces formed. Everyone was busy addressing symptoms, while carefully avoiding the deeper truth. The structure had been quietly propped up by one person for a long time, and that person had stopped doing it. Daniel's behavior shifted noticeably then. Not aggressively, not defensively, but with a subtle urgency I hadn't seen before. He began checking in more often, asking for my perspective earlier, looping me into conversations that used to happen without me. On the surface, it looked like progress. It wasn't. It was too late to fix it the old way, because what they were offering now wasn't alignment. It was dependence made visible by discomfort. They wanted my presence back in its previous form, the quiet stabilizer, the invisible correction layer, the person who absorbed complexity so leadership didn't have to. But that version of me no longer existed. Daniel finally named it during a one-on-one, his tone careful. "It feels like you're less involved," he said. Not accusing, just observing. I met his gaze calmly. "I'm involved in everything that's within my role." There it was, the boundary stated without emotion. He frowned slightly, as if trying to reconcile that with his experience. "You've always gone above and beyond." "Yes," I said. "So I have." The silence that followed was different from the others. It wasn't empty. It was loaded. With realization, with regret, with a dawning awareness that something had shifted beyond quick repair. He tried again. "Is there something you need?" It was the right question, asked too late. What I needed wasn't reassurance or appreciation or more meetings. What I needed was structural truth, clear authority aligned with responsibility. And I knew in that moment that he couldn't give it without destabilizing his own position. My success had threatened it long before I ever said a word. So I answered honestly but narrowly. "I need clarity," I said, "about scope, about ownership, about accountability." He nodded slowly, took notes, promised to look into it. But systems don't change because someone looks into them. They change when people are willing to give something up, and no one was ready to do that. Over the following weeks, the strain intensified. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Decisions stalled. Workarounds piled up. The absence of my old interventions created a vacuum that leadership couldn't quite fill. They tried to redistribute responsibilities, to formalize things quickly, to retrofit structure onto habits that had grown in the dark. But the trust that allowed me to operate invisibly, to fix without permission, couldn't be recreated on demand. And I wouldn't offer it again. That's when panic began to surface. Not outwardly, but in tone. Meetings felt sharper. Questions are more pointed. There was an undercurrent of urgency that hadn't existed before. They wanted to rewind. They couldn't. Because once you see how a system truly functions, you can't go back to pretending it's something else. And once someone stops compensating for an imbalance, that imbalance becomes undeniable. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, only certainty. Certainty that staying would mean returning to a role that no longer fit. Certainty that any attempt to fix things without realignment would fail. Certainty that the discomfort they were experiencing was not a crisis, but a consequence. And consequences once felt can't be undone with good intentions. They had mistaken my silence for acceptance, and by the time they realized it was a choice, the version of the arrangement they wanted back was already gone. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It was scheduled, labeled vaguely. Alignment discussion. Daniel invited me into his office late one afternoon. The door closed softly behind us. No tension in the air, just a careful stillness, like both of us knew this conversation mattered, even if we were pretending it didn't. He didn't start with accusations. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't list grievances. He said, "I want to understand where you see yourself here." It was the first time he had ever asked me that question directly. I took a moment before answering, not to perform calm, but because I actually felt it. The emotional charge that might have existed months earlier was gone. What remained was clarity. I see myself doing work that already exists, I said, and carrying responsibility that hasn't been acknowledged structurally. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that answer. I've always trusted you, he said. You know that. I do, I replied. Trust hasn't been the issue. That landed. He leaned forward. Then what is? I didn't give him a long explanation. I didn't recount history. I didn't bring up meetings or moments or missed credit. None of that mattered anymore. I realized my boss needed me to fail, I said calmly. Not openly, not intentionally, but structurally. He looked up sharply, not offended, but startled. I continued evenly. As long as I stayed quiet, absorbed risk, and kept things running, the system worked. For you, for leadership, for everyone. My success, fully acknowledged, would have required change. The room was silent. I could see him processing, not emotionally, but analytically. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't cruel. He was just part of a system that had optimized itself around convenience. I never wanted that, he said finally. I know, I replied, and I meant it. That doesn't change the outcome. There was no argument after that. No denial. Just a quiet recognition that intent and impact had diverged too far to reconcile easily. He asked what I wanted, not in a bargaining way, in a resigned one. I told him the truth. I want my role to match reality, I said, with clear authority, protection, and scope, or I need to step out of it. He exhaled slowly. That would require restructuring, he said. Yes. And approvals. Yes. And time. Yes. He leaned back, eyes unfocused. He knew what that meant. Restructuring would expose dependencies. It would force questions he wasn't ready to answer. It would shift power in ways that couldn't be quietly controlled. He wasn't refusing. He was calculating. I can't promise that, he said. Sid. I know, I replied. That was it. No anger, no ultimatums, no raised voices. Just two people acknowledging a truth that had been forming for a long time. The confrontation didn't end with a decision. It ended with an understanding. The arrangement we had been operating under was finished. I stood up, thanked him for the conversation, and walked back to my desk feeling lighter than I had in years. Not victorious, unburdened. Because confrontation doesn't always look like conflict. Sometimes it looks like clarity, delivered without heat. After that conversation, nothing snapped into place. And that was exactly what I expected. There was no immediate restructuring, no dramatic announcement, no sudden recognition of everything I had carried. The organization moved the way organizations always do, slowly, cautiously, with an instinct to preserve itself. But I had already moved, not physically at first, internally. The clarity from that confrontation settled into something steadier, self-definition. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't measuring myself against how useful I was to others. I was measuring myself against alignment between what I did, what I was responsible for, and what I was protected by. That changed everything. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped volunteering emotional labor. I stopped managing impressions. When people asked for support, I asked for context. When decisions were made, I asked for documentation. When expectations were unclear, I didn't fill in the blanks. Some people adjusted, others didn't, and that told me what I needed to know. I also noticed how much energy I had been spending maintaining a version of myself that fit comfortably into other people's expectations. Without that effort, I had more focus, more patience, more creativity. I wasn't harder, I was clearer. My work improved, not because I was doing more, but because I was doing what mattered. I chose projects intentionally. I engaged where my authority matched my responsibility. And when it didn't, I named the gap calmly. That alone changed how I was perceived. Not because people suddenly respected me more, but because they couldn't rely on me to quietly fix things anymore. They had to meet me where I stood. I began exploring opportunities beyond my role, not urgently, not secretly, just honestly. Conversations with people who saw my work for what it was, not for how it could be used. Roles where competence wasn't something to manage around, but something to build with. And for the first time, I felt no rush. Because I wasn't escaping something, I was choosing something. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. I had expected, at some point, to feel anger about the years of invisibility, about the praise that never translated, about the way my success had been quietly absorbed into someone else's authority. It never came. What came instead was understanding. Understanding that systems don't reward goodness by default. They reward clarity, leverage, and alignment. And that silence, while often virtuous, becomes costly when it's mistaken for consent. I don't regret who I was. That version of me was learning, observing, building skills I didn't yet know I would need. She wasn't weak. She was preparing. And I don't resent the people who couldn't see me fully. Most of them were operating within constraints they had never questioned. I don't excuse the outcome, but I don't personalize it either. Who I am now is someone who knows the difference between being valued and being relied on. Someone who understands that quiet dominance isn't about withholding. It's about choosing where your energy goes. Someone who no longer needs to be underestimated to feel safe. I didn't become louder. I became truer. If there's a lesson in this story, it isn't about bosses or companies or even power. It's about silence, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from competence. The silence of people who do the work, hold things together, and believe that impact will eventually be noticed without being named. Sometimes it is, often it isn't. I learned that systems don't ask who is carrying them. They only notice when the weight shifts. And if you've been the one quietly absorbing pressure for a long time, that shift can feel destabilizing, not just for others, but for you. There's a particular kind of loneliness in realizing your success has been managed rather than celebrated, not because you weren't good enough, but because you were too useful in the wrong way. I don't share this to warn you against being capable, or calm, or generous with your effort. Those qualities matter. They build trust, they create stability. But they also require boundaries, because when your value is measured only by how much you prevent problems, you become invisible the moment things appear to work. And when your silence is interpreted as acceptance, staying quiet becomes a decision, whether you intend it to or not. The hardest part of this journey wasn't being overlooked. It was recognizing my own role in maintaining the arrangement, in choosing ease over alignment, in believing that patience alone would change a structure that benefited from my stillness. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It was clarity. Clarity about what I was no longer willing to subsidize with my energy. Clarity about the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. Clarity about the kind of work and the kind of life I wanted to build. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't demand justice in a dramatic way. I simply stopped being silent by default. And that was enough. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, I want you to know this. Noticing the pattern doesn't mean you have to act immediately. Awareness isn't a command. It's an invitation. An invitation to ask yourself where your effort goes unrecognized, where your calm is mistaken for consent, where your success might be quietly threatening someone else's position, not because you want it to, but because it reveals the truth. You don't owe anyone your invisibility. You don't have to become loud to become powerful. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is let the system experience what it has been leaning on, and then decide calmly whether it still deserves your strength. I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that your silence was being mistaken for acceptance? And if so, what did you do next?